Paul has, to a large extent, actually covered pretty much almost the first half of what I was going to present. I'll go through it a little bit quicker than I ordinarily would have. May I ask something? Do the participants get a copy of the slides?
Yes.
All right. So you'll get a copy of the slides and can pick up on it. Just the one thing I just want to say up front is I will use examples of African countries to make my points as I go along. Please don't feel I'm picking on any particular country at all. All right. So Paul mentioned the types of conflicts that we see in Africa. Well, I sat with a number of colleagues and tried to do a breakdown of the conflicts that we have had to deal with as part of the World Bank. Now, the question that might be asked is, why is the World Bank interested in conflict? Surely there's institutions like the United Nations, and in Africa increasingly so the African Union, who is beginning to play a much more prominent role in conflict resolution and peace talks, and increasingly so will do in security sector reform and in DDR, which I'll talk to in detail a little later on. So why the World Bank? Well, the World Bank is a primary institution that invests money into development and lends money at pretty low interest rates to governments. Now, back in 2002, after the Pretoria peace talks on the DRC came to an end, there was a need of a massive investment that ran into the billions, hundreds of billions in the DRC. And it was necessary to look at both security sector reform and DDR, SSR and DDR. So the bank decided to actually get involved in this and get involved in DDR. So we have a history that runs now for about a dozen years of looking at conflict and looking at the impact of conflict in Africa. Bank does the same in other parts of the world. I work only on the African side. So if we look at the types of wars that we've had over the years, through the independent wars, and starting off from 1960 onwards, we've had a series of independence wars. Most of them faded out by the late 70s. Probably the last one to have run is Namibia. There's some arguments that there's an independence war also being fought in the West Saharan. Well, there is one at the moment. Interstate conflicts between countries, those also existed. The last major one we had was Ethiopia, Eritrea, where a crazy war was fought over a couple of square meters of land and resulted in some enormous casualties that we haven't seen since the First World War in global terms. But largely there's not been too many. It's sometimes been over small issues and, beg your pardon, sorry. And also in the early days around sort of border demarcations. There have also been a series of intrastate conflicts. These have been much more common. Paul spoke about that. And it was only at the turn of the century that we started looking at the whole concept of a regional conflict. We've tended to, up until then, we tended to look at conflicts within an individual country's perspective, rather than trying to look at it at a regional perspective and then look at solutions being regional solutions. The examples I've put up there would have been the Great Lakes region. One could not have solved or could not solve the problems of the Eastern DRC without also looking at Rwanda, without also looking at Burundi, or the other way around, and also Uganda. So there's a multitude of players. It's the same in the Horn of Africa. It's the same in the Mano River Basin. And it is and will be the same in the Sahel as well. These are regional conflicts of which a solution doesn't lie within one country at all, but lies in terms of dealing with it across borders and with neighboring countries. We've had a series of coups d'etats and rebellions and secession conflicts. One of the interesting things that actually jumped out at us, it's something that one knows, but when one looks at the hard statistics, it stares at you, is how specific countries tend to have coups d'etats much more often than other countries. I don't think we found a single case of a single coup d'etat. It's coup d'etat after coup d'etat after coup d'etat after coup d'etat. But I'll come to that when I deal with some of the issues that Paul was also talking about, which are related to fragility. Now, some of these conflicts that evolve because of these particular issues, let's put aside tribal and ethnic clashes. That happens. As an African, I always get annoyed because it tends to, people look at us and say it only happens in Africa. Well, it doesn't. It's happened in Europe. There was a devastating war in the former Yugoslavia, which was all about ethnicity and culture. It happens in the Middle East, where it's around religion and ethnicity and culture. So it's not an African phenomenon. But we've had our fair share, and we continue to have skirmishes and continue to have that as we run. We're seeing part of it, although I wouldn't necessarily call it a tribal conflict currently in South Sudan, but we are seeing that the manifestations of that still existing. Organized crime and trafficking, right? Paul mentioned it. It's on the increase, will continue to increase, and becomes and continues to be a problem, and will get worse. Conflicts caused by environmental degradation. Urban violence and conflict, something we saw during the Arab Spring, but it's actually not new. If we just go back in time and we look at the latter years of wars of independence, it does begin as an urban uprising and spreads out. It's actually quite rare that they begin in rural areas. And then competition over natural resources as well. What we're seeing is these transnational conflicts, also mentioned by Paul, around ideological movements. We see that in, if I take a number of protagonists at the moment, Al-Shabaab, which cuts across Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Boko Haram, which covers 4 countries at the moment and will spread, Akim, which cuts across the Sahel. It's not just in Mali alone. And this again is part of the regional warfare, the regional conflicts that we talk about. So why do they occur? Why does conflicts occur? Now this is interesting. Again, Paul was talking about it earlier on. A number of studies have been done. And we can talk about environmental issues, we can talk about drawing borders, we can talk about types of security and who benefits and not benefits. But if we bring it down, and this comes from research undertaken in 11 African countries, what are the main reasons? This is a citizen's view of why there's conflict in their country. The 2 main reasons that stand out and far outstrip the rest are injustice, inequality, and corruption is one reason, and the second one is poverty and poor education. So actually, you can bolster up your security forces, you can bolster up your borders, you can create the most amazing military or police structure you want, an intelligence system. Don't deal with those 2, and fragility continues. And with fragility, as we will see just now, so do ongoing problems. All right, so if we start to strip this down and we start to look at what are the 3 main areas, again touched on by Paul. One is a deficit in governance and security. I'm not going to talk about it because it's been spoken about. Corruption and weak institutions. The latter is often not properly understood. Okay, we don't understand what a weak institution is and what an institution is. Institutions in society vary. They could be from a medical insurance system, they are the health system, it is the education system, it is your banking systems. It's different systems in society. And if those are strong within society, they act also as a barrier to potential conflict. Right? We have countries. Let me throw out an example. Let me just ask you guys a question. If we have a country where there is a general election, and the person who gets the most votes is not appointed prime minister or president or whatever type of leadership name we want to give, all right? We have a country where you can buy arms or access arms almost at will wherever you want to. We have a country, the same country, where you can form militias and oppose your government if you like. Does that make it a fragile country that could collapse? Yes, it does. Well, that country is the United States of America. All those things happen. And yet the United States of America does not collapse because it has really strong institutions, all right? Corruption isn't rife and governance and security works. So on these 3 pillars, are important, right? So you get it. If those all don't work, we have insecurity, instability, volatility, which causes conflict. And once we have conflict, it's a circular relationship because conflict exacerbates the deficit in governance and security, it intensifies corruption, and it further aggravates and weakens institutions. All right? Now, some of those stresses Paul spoke about. So in the interests of moving a bit faster, I'm just going to go, I'm not going to run through them, but we do have internal and external stresses, which when we add to the weak and illegitimate institutions, we have an increase in the potential for conflict. I beg your pardon, that was a bit too quick. I'll just go back. And those are just a list of internal stresses that one could have and a list of external stresses. In terms of your own countries, if you go through this list, and it's by no means a finite list, and start ticking them off, do they exist in your country? The more ticks you have, the greater the potential of future conflict happening. All right? Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit about fragility, because when all these issues issues exist within a country is classified as fragile. So, we looked at 40 countries that would have been classified as fragile for 5 or more years between 1978 and 1990. Of those 40 countries, 24 remain fragile. So once your country is fragile, it is really, really difficult to pull out of fragility, particularly if there's weak governance and security, endemic corruption, and weak institutions. It is difficult to pull out. 16 did pull out. Right, amongst those 16 would be Botswana, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Zambia. They're just a handful of those 16. But of those fragile countries, probably the ones that are at the very bottom of the list, DRC, CAR, Chad, Somalia, the 2 Sudans, they exist. And what defines all those at the moment, or what's common to all those, is some level of conflict within all those states. There is a list of fragility. And if we look at the current list of fragility, it's almost a list that if you had to take bets as to where the next conflict is going to break out, on the high alert, there are 5 countries in Africa: South Sudan, Somalia, CAR, DRC, and Sudan. Right? As I said, some level of conflict exists. That was a very high alert. On a high alert, we have Chad, Zimbabwe, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau. And then there's other countries on alert, and you work your way down. When we look at this map, I missed one, sorry. When we look at this map, and we can see fragility, the darker the shading, the more fragile the country, if we overlay where current conflict takes place, it almost is a perfect match. I could remove fragility as the issue and just put conflict in, and we will see almost an identical map. There will be very few countries that are not fragile where conflict exists. All right. Again, what we see here, this is just a map where we look at conflict and development. And in this particular issue, the first one is poverty. In the very red at the top, we see high poverty and continued conflict. Where we see conflict decreasing on the orange line, you see how poverty levels also decrease as well. Again, in the second graph, the lines in purple are countries which are fragile and where there's conflict, and you can see how the per capita levels are very, very low. So we're talking the obvious, that obviously conflict causes very low per capita, very low development, much higher poverty, and instability just continues onwards. All right, so Paul also mentioned there are external actors that are involved in transitioning from conflict. It is interesting as well, we looked at the total number of UN interventions. There are 18 UN missions, DPKO missions currently around the world. 10 of those sit in Africa. The longest being in the Western Sahara, which has been there since 1991. We're also increasingly seeing more and more AU interventions, and I think over time we will start seeing many more AU and less UN, particularly in Africa. But as things stand now, we have 14 forces, intervening forces to maintain some sort of peace in a number of African states. So, let me start moving a little bit quicker. What should follow conflict are peace talks. In my mind, sometimes peace talks can be as problematic as the conflict itself because of the way that we structure peace talks. Firstly, just prior to peace, when the various protagonists agree that peace is necessary, we see an escalation of violence, an escalation of conflict as the various protagonists try to gain more land, more resources, more whatever, in order to increase the bargaining position during peace. And then we have these incredibly prolonged processes that drag on and on and on. And we see it now. The two of the current peace talks that I'm involved with are the ones in Algiers, in Mali peace talks, and also in South Sudan, in Addis Ababa. They're just carrying on with no end in sight, no agreement sometimes on the basics. There was an intervention with the Tanzanian government that hopefully will start boosting and moving the South Sudanese peace talks, but they're problematic. They're problematic because there's often insufficient trust by the various parties in how the peace talks are managed. And sometimes if we step back and we look at the organizations who are meant to lead the peace talks, one can understand why sometimes there's a lack of trust in those organizations, because those organizations themselves are sometimes problematic in terms of being the referee or the umpire in the middle to ensure fair rules. Now, again, it was mentioned earlier on, the need for a national action to take place. Peace talks by themselves do not start creating the foundations for future non-conflict. Governments themselves need to send out some immediate signals, right? And from the very beginning, there's a level of participation by other parts of society that need to be brought into government. Often we just don't see that. What we tend to find is perhaps protagonists getting together, forming some kind of government of national unity. Civil society gets left outside, other structures get left outside, and what you've brought in together are those groups of people for whom conflict was a natural way of expression, rather than bringing other expressive people with other expressive mechanisms into a conflict resolution process. There need to be commitment mechanisms, and we need to set realistic targets. Again, please, you're going to have to excuse me. I'll go quicker because I want to talk about SSR and DDR. But just one thing I do want to mention, citizen security was spoken about earlier on, but the one area where we're increasingly beginning to focus in, it's an area the bank has not previously worked in, but we are now seeing it as absolutely important, is the criminal justice system. Overhauling the criminal justice system and creating changes to the criminal justice system is as equally important as looking at security sector reform and looking at a DDR process. And by the criminal justice system, there's numerous components to it, but probably the most basic ones are the police services, the actual law courts themselves, the correctional facilities or prison services, and the social work services. Right? Those are absolutely crucial to look at and need to be dealt with immediately. There are some countries that I have worked with in the past. I've worked through 14 DDR processes where I've seen security sector reform in some together with DDR, in others just a combination, or one or the other, but rarely have I seen the criminal justice system looked at. Transitional justice comes into play. Let's deal with issues and let's deal with the problems of conflict. Yes, sure, and that should happen. But that's a separate process to looking at the criminal justice system. And often what will happen is police services that might have existed in a previous regime or a previous order or previously, per se, often sometimes just get swept away. And policemen make absolutely brilliant criminals. We've seen that. We saw that in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular. We saw that in the Soviet Union, where a police force that was ideologically motivated to exist under a particular government is then badly treated under a new government. They disappear back into society, and often some elements of that go rogue. And we then deal with criminal elements which are very, very difficult to control afterwards. All right, and of course, I guess the final thing is it's absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential that governments look and regimes look at expanding livelihood opportunities, small things. We know that in Africa, at least half of our population will be involved in agriculture. Let's have a look at some post-conflict countries. Let's look at, in the immediate aftermath of conflict when peace sets in, how much effort is put into the agricultural sector? Very, very little. People will live off the land. It doesn't matter. All right? We look at improving universities, perhaps. We look at improving the health sector, and we should be doing that, no doubt. But how often do we actually focus on the agricultural sector? We don't. Because if we're looking at it purely from a security perspective, yes, any future issues or problems will be urban-based and they'll emerge from the urban centers. But as food scarcity kicks in, and we've perhaps got a long way to go in Africa, the problem, the cause of the problem will shift. All right, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump, and I'm going to jump straight to post-conflict state building and start talking about SSR and DDR. All right, security sector reform. The objective of security sector is to transform institutions to make them more professional and more accountable, and to embrace effective and accountable security for the state and its people. Now, I'm going to jump the next block. I'll come back to it if you don't mind. Because when we talk about security sector reform, in most people's minds is, yes, we will look at the military and see how we can deal with it. And that's absolutely important, no doubt. But it's all those pillars are all part of the security sector. It's defense, it's police, it's intelligence, it's border security, it's prisons, it's also non-state security providers. Increasingly, we see more and more of them around the world, and they also have to be part of an SSR process. There's civil society, there's parliament, there's judiciary, and there's more. All right, all those need to be part of an SSR process. Dealing only with the military doesn't deal with the problem. All right, now, I said I would go back. We also need to have disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And the objective of that is to contribute to security and stability in post-conflict environment. And in DDR, we have three components. There's disarmament, there's demobilization, and there's reintegration. DDR cannot work without SSR. I have worked in countries where there's been DDR alone. In the long term, it fails. People rush in. Donors put in an enormous amount of money because they feel this is what they need to do. But if there's no security sector reform, DDR doesn't work. Now, the problem internationally is that there are certain international actors, and I will name them because there's nothing wrong with it, United States, United Kingdom, the Netherlands. They tend to look at SSR. They're very good at advising on SSR. They have all the right tools, they have all the right kind of funding, and they can talk SSR. On the other hand, we have DDR, and that tends to be underwritten by countries such as Sweden, Norway, Finland, European Union. European Union also does SSR as well. All right, France, Belgium. They don't talk to each other. I'm working on 2 DDR programs right now. I go blue in the face when I go to the embassies of countries who are pouring millions into security sector reform, and they have no interest what we do in DDR. And then there's other countries it's the other way around. They don't talk. And then when I talk with the national governments, they say, well, go and talk to your guys. I say, who are my guys? You're taking the money to come in here. You're the client. This is what you should be demanding. But unfortunately, the power relations don't kind of work like that. But it's absolutely essential they should to be together. And as I said earlier on, for ourselves, the third pillar is reform in the criminal justice system. So, I'm just mindful of time. SSR has a number of dimensions. The 2 most important ones would be the political dimension and the technical dimension. All right. The idea is to achieve the types of virtues that Paul was talking about. Is in society to create a value system that's based on freedom, on rights, on security, and to do away with authoritarian and traditional and undemocratic regimes. It actually makes for a much stronger government. All right. On a technical dimension is to improve institutions, is to professionalize systems. Now, let's put it this way. I've worked with many, many soldiers. And we put soldiers sometimes through a DDR process and not through security sector reform. In one country where I work, average that a soldier will earn is around $240 a month. That's a well-paid soldier. And we tell that soldier, come, I'm going to send you on 8 weeks of vocational training to teach you how to be a farmer where you will be lucky to make $300 a year. But don't worry, man, this is the way you should go. Right? We want peace in this country, so you're no longer going to earn $240 a month. You'll make $300 a year, and you'll have a nice little piece of land, and I want you to be happy. And that little bit of shrapnel that you got in your leg, it'll eventually work its way out. It doesn't work like that, because part of security sector reform is professionalizing the military, ensuring there's proper pension systems, ensuring there's a proper medical for soldiers. So once you create a life after the army for a soldier, it's much easier for a soldier to leave the army. All of these exist in the West and North America and in many other countries. They tend generally not exist in most African states. And that's why security sector reform is absolutely vital. All right. I think the example we used there was around, it was looking at the police service, is looking at the whole issue. Oh, here's the other thing as well. Here's the other thing. Often when we want to try and change institutions, we come up with a brilliant strategy. Right? In many instances, we go and employ these huge, big international accounting firms and these big consultancies who will come out and they'll give us a perfect strategy. Right? What we never look at, or we rarely look at, is culture within an organization. All right? Culture and changes in culture normally should start at the very top. All right? This is unfortunately a top-down thing. We always talk about developing bottom-up, but this is a top-down thing. We don't look at culture. And there's a saying that says, culture eats strategy every time for breakfast. So you can put in the best possible strategy in the world. We can pour in millions. If we don't look to make a cultural shift within an institution or an organization, including many of those we're talking about today, we don't make a change. We don't get past zero. We've just wasted our money and our time, and we'd have been better off doing fishing or something else. All right, so that's why we sit that at the very top, that culture needs to change, educational training, all this, all those issues. All right. Let me shoot to DDR. All right. Within DDR, there's a number of steps. All right, and they all throw up unique challenges to us. The first is ensuring we get the right people to go through DDR, because DDR, we can have SSR with formal military. When we're talking around armed groups and armed forces, we don't have a formal role and a payroll, etc. that we can say, right, who's who. People just arrive. So somehow we have to vet them. There needs to be a verification and a profiling of members of armed groups. Here we can play a game. There's a country in which 2 countries actually, which 140 million was spent to do DDR. In total, less than 20,000 people went through this. It's absolutely criminal. This is corruption at a global scale and really had little to do with Africa. This was institutions that applied it, right? Of those, we've gone back and just looked at some of the numbers. 85% had never been to the military, had never picked up a gun, all right? But various commanders sent them through. Part of the packages went back to the commanders, and the commanders sat with their army with their guns very, very quietly. Unsurprisingly, we're going back now, structuring a DDR program. We just went in and ran a pilot in one of these countries. Four provinces within that country sent us soldiers. We now put a proper vetting mechanism in. All right? Of that, from the one section, we rejected 78% from the one province. From another province, we rejected 84%. From 2 provinces, we rejected under 20% from each. Why that happened, I don't know. Civil war broke out soon after that. All right? But verification is really important, and quite often when we see an easy DDR process, it's not that easy. There was an interesting one. You want me to finish up? All right, I'll bring it to a close in 2 minutes. Interestingly, in one country, where a whole lot of people turned up claiming to have been ex-combatants, they were given a stick, or a piece of metal actually, that weighed a couple of kilograms, and told to run for 2.4 kilometers, all right? And very few actually managed it. Those are the ones that went into DDR. I thought that was interesting. All right, we go through the disarmament and demobilization. People go through a transition facilities, and then there's reinsertion into their communities and reintegration. What we want to achieve there is, when reintegrating people into communities, is to give them skills to be able to create a basic livelihood. What we have found over time is the skills that really matter the most is entrepreneurial skills, how to run a small business. It is not natural. It's not something you grow up with and you know. Basic life skills, and how to set up cooperatives and associations. The more and more of those that we see, the more successful, more sustainable people are in their vocations. There are special needs groups that need to be dealt with differently. We're about to start a 4th DDR program in a particular country, and it's taken me 4 months to convince the government that they do need to have a specific and a special program for women ex-combatants, for children ex-combatants, for disabled ex-combatants, and for medical and for psychosocially traumatized ex-combatants. They need to take separate pathways and separate routes back into reintegration. Otherwise, a problem just reoccurs further down the line. And the final new thing that we're dealing with is this whole radicalization issue, and how do you de-radicalize ex-combatants? There's some interesting work being done in Pakistan at the moment. There's some interesting work done at British universities, which we're bringing in. We're experimenting with some of these in Somalia at the moment. And I think, yeah. So basically, SSR and DDR, together with the criminal justice system and institutional building, just makes for greater resilience and sustainability in a country moving forward. And I just leave you with a quote up there. I'm sorry it was a little bit disjointed. I had to jump around. Thank you very much.